in a book that I wrote fairly recently, The Oak Papers, there was kind of a personal layering to the narrative, but I never wanted to go too much into that. But I did want to go into the fact that throughout history, oak trees and humans have had this close connection, and that by being connected with ancient oak trees, we feel better. But then the way that I want to do things is say, this is the scientific evidence for it. And then I'm just going to narrate me standing by an oak tree and feeling better.
Welcome to Wild Muse. In celebration of our Nature Writing Prize, my guest today is James Canton, who has written 5 non-fiction books and leads the Wild Writing MA programme at Essex. We're going to be chatting about James's latest book, Grounded, which is both a personal journey and an investigation into the relationship our ancestors had with the land. We're also going to be chatting about the connection between nature and well-being and so much more. Thank you so much for joining me, James.
Nice to be here. Nice to be here indeed, Gabriela. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd really love to start, James, before we dive into Grounded, really just panning out so that we can get a sense of where nature writing began for you.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I've been teaching nature writing as a sort of discrete subject since 2009, which is the MA in Wild Writing at the University of Essex. So that was set up as a kind of interdisciplinary master's course for students who are coming from all different angles, kind of environmental science, biological science, literature, poetry, whatever, who were kind of interested in writing about aspects of the landscape, of the natural world, of our relationship with it. And I think that's, so on one level, that's where my nature writing kind of emerges from. And it's been great. It's been great because obviously in that time since 2009, what we've seen particularly in Britain, I think, but possibly all over the world as well, is a kind of reinvigoration, a kind of re-examination of the way in which we as humans are part of the natural world and how we kind of narrate that, if you like. And that's been great, movement that's sort of often called the new nature writing movement. Some people don't particularly like that. It's not particularly expressive, but it does express something of this kind of sense of there used to be ways in which people in Britain would narrate the natural world, and how that's kind of changed in the last 20 years or so. And I think you can see clear kind of differentiations. On another level, I guess as a kind of suburban child of London, I wouldn't say I was a writer in any way. I didn't, but having said that, it was the only thing really in school that I kind of connected with was kind of writing stories. So, I remember in year 7 or whatever, writing a story about sliding down Horsenden Hill in the snow and that kind of thing, and that kind of sensory kind of layering of kind of being immersed, physically immersed in snow at the end of the toboggan run, where you kind of ended up kind of head planted in a very snowy patch of ground. But that kind of thing. And I we were very fortunate. We lived in a fairly rundown house with a kind of wild garden, and I was kind of very much encouraged, you get out, you spend your days outside. So I think that forges aspects of the connection with the natural world, even in a suburban child. And obviously there's lots of issues to do with the way in which our children now, are we allowing them this space in the natural world? I mean, it's very much, my upbringing was, you weren't really in the house during the day. You were either in school or you were kind of in the garden or in the park or in the street,
Yeah.
So, nature writing, I think, emerges from all that time spent, really, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you've brought in that urban aspect, because this is something that I've been chatting about in this community, because obviously we're with the Nature Writing Prize, we're really letting people know you don't have to be in a specifically beautiful landscape to want to write about nature. You can be in an urban setting and literally just looking out of your window, looking at the garden. So I'm really glad that you can take us back to those roots that you had yourself in an urban setting.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. It's such an important point, and this is one of the kind of key um, changes, if you like, in the way that nature writing has exploded in the last 20 years or so in Britain. In that there's been this kind of, the gates have been opened to the masses, the hordes that aren't just kind of white landowners, that are perhaps even brought up in cities. Um, there's one of the great writers of the modern times that I like is David Lindo, who kind of grew up sort of down the road from me in West London, and he's known as the urban birder. He's always kind of framed himself as this figure of this urban birder, and I think that kind of a figure like David Lindo, Nigerian heritage, kind of, I think 50 years ago he would have been he'd have been struggling to write that book. It wouldn't have been culturally kind of seen as a possible route for him. And it's lovely to see a book like that being an emergent voice within the nature writing, if you like. And that not only opens up different diverse peoples to nature writing in Britain, but it opens up that idea of the urban population. This is one of the big shifts, I think, in nature writing that often is kind of slightly not really talked about. But that idea that, we are as humans always in nature. We are nature ourselves. We cannot ever escape from nature. And I think, the most extreme human environments, human constructed environments that you can imagine, I don't know whether it's at the top of the Shard or something like that, or, you're still in nature, and it's such an important point to get across, is particularly when we're trying to navigate our way through the current climate emergencies and, the way in which we perceive and see ourselves as a species is going to be vital to that. And I think, there's a sense in which nature writing can help remind us and narrate that journey, if you like. So yeah, absolutely. It's really good to see urban nature writers emerge. And I'm hoping that, you'll get a good flurry of them entering the competition as well.
Yeah, we're hoping so. Yeah. Thank you for that, James. So let's come to Grounded. I really enjoyed this book for so many reasons. And I think one of the things that really struck me as I was reading the book, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, is I'm on your shoulder as you're going on an investigation. So there's almost like the stakes are quite high. It's a sense of like, what are you going to discover? You're picking up books and you're watching videos as you're writing the book. So I'm really curious about the decision that you made to write the book in this way, to write us as an investigation going on, and to have the reader there with you, and to have you picking up books and reading and having conversations sort of in the narrative itself.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriela. It's I guess it's a kind of narrative choice. I think, we're kind of conscious that there's been I'm conscious, my PhD was on kind of post-colonial studies of travel writing in Arabia. And, I'm always conscious that there is this kind of lineage of kind of a colonial voice that kind of goes out and comes back and tells you some truth about humans. And I'm very much, conscious of that there are other ways to write books and to narrate an investigation into what it is to be human, which is often what most books are really about, on a very simple level. And I've found that it's a powerful way of, like, kind of, if a book is a journey, taking the reader on that journey, one way that you can do it is by a kind of an honest depiction of the kind of research program that goes into writing a book. And obviously not every aspect of it is kind of, you don't want to, they don't need to sit there for the hours and hours that you spend in a library or something like that, but they can be there often, as you say, kind of peering over your shoulder as you do voyage into aspects of landscape and go on sort of adventures into, small chapels or churchyards or ancient monuments, prehistoric sites. I think it can be a powerful way forward. And as you say, not always is it right that everyone just sees this kind of perfect journey, because that's not often the way that things work out. And you do kind of, sometimes it's pouring with rain, and then you get there and it's freezing cold, and the experience that you thought you were going to have is slightly altered in some way. But I think it creates a more honest, genuine, kind of emotive layering to a reading of a book, if you are kind of, if you feel that you're very much in with the author and going on that journey with them. Yeah, definitely.
And also, I think that altering that you mentioned, I feel it was so important for me, not just as a reader, but also as a writer. There isn't this sense of, I'm going to set myself a task to write about, and I'm going to know exactly what that is before I set out, and I'm going to be able to write about it perfectly, and everything's going to be neatly tied up. We've got that beautiful journey that you take where you're going to slip a chapel in the village of Walsingham. And because you've been in a previous chapel, which was just this lovely, peaceful experience, we're sort of aware that you've got a sense of expectation of, I think it's going to be similar.
Yeah.
And of course, you get there and there's hordes of people, which you didn't have at the chapel in Lindsay. And you're really discombobulated, and you're like sitting in your car eating a sandwich. And I love that sense of, we can set off on a journey and, have a sort of mild panic that we've arrived at our destination and we just weren't prepared for what we get. And then, of course, a little bit later on, you're driving and you're not following a map, and there's a rainstorm, and you get to a crossroads and you see a pub, and you're suddenly like, I've got an idea. So we also get a sense of what can happen to the story when you leave the map. So can you tell us a little bit more about that moment? Because it leads to you in this experience of saying wow out loud, which I just love. Because we go from your kind of panic, sitting in the car all alone, being disconnected, to this incredible experience that you have in nature. And that to me is what's so beautiful about being alongside you on this spontaneous investigative journey.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you picked up on those layerings, because it's all true. I promise. It's like, I mean, that's one thing that I always find really important, that there's a veracity that the reader can kind of like seize on and kind of know. I mean, it's the central tenet of all nonfiction writing, is that the reader must believe that this is the truth, if you know what I mean. And it was. And Walsingham very much. I mean, this book for many years was known to my friends as the Sacred Spaces book. And I would kind of talk to them about bits of, I went to this amazing place yesterday, and, or whatever. But it had been kind of gestating for a long period. And as you say, there were I'd go into various chapels. And in fact, the book really begins in a small chapel called Lindsay Chapel, which is in Suffolk. Not too far from me, but it's a beautiful kind of personal chapel almost. But on a freezing cold February day, and it was so cold, and it smelled of kind of lime plaster and earth, and was genuinely kind of like one of those moments of almost like epiphany of like, wow, you could feel the sacredness there, if you like. And it was a kind of personal moment. I was the only one for miles, not quite for miles, but it was very personal. And I thought, and as you say, a little bit later, I headed to Walsingham, and I'd been, I thought this will be a perfect kind of follow on. And it was just, it's a well-known pilgrimage site, and the presence of hundreds of worshippers entirely altered the experience for me. I mean, there were moments of it that were very powerful. Actually, sitting in the Slipper Chapel, in relatively complete silence, but with a number of other people. And as you say, I kind of really wasn't quite sure what to make of it all, and kind of sort of slightly legged it from the site in my car. And ended up in a little bit. I know North Norfolk really well because I always went there on family holidays for years and years and years, and still do. And ended up in a little village called Warham, which is a beautiful little village, and it's not far. I suddenly saw this sign. I was like, "Oh, Warham, yeah, okay, great." Ended up at the Three Horseshoes pub, which is a really good pub, and then thought, "Oh, I'll go to Warham Camp," which for anyone who doesn't know it is for me the finest, like the most emotive and evocative Iceni camp, like Iron Age camp, certainly in sort of in East Anglia. It's certainly the place where I can feel Boudica. You can feel like Boudica is around. She's here, sort of the essence of her, the presence of these Iron Age British folk. And it's a place I always loved going to. So I went there and had this lovely moment where this sort of double rainbow appeared, and I was like, "Wow, this is cool." And then kind of went there and was sort of suddenly in a much more spiritually enlightened moment, if you like, compared to being in Walsingham Chapel. And that's not to denigrate the kind of sacredness of Walsingham Chapel to many, many people, but in that instant it just didn't do it for me, in the same sense that actually being out in nature, standing under an oak tree, kind of in rain and sunshine with a huge rainbow, and stepping into, as I say, an ancient site, a prehistoric site. And I guess it was also a kind of reminder to me that these are my sacred places, really. And that I'm not a practicing Christian, but but having said that, I could still go into chapels, and like Philip Larkin was a good kind of cultural commentator that I carried with me, who he would famously, famous poet, brilliant kind of commentator, writer on many things, but he would talk about going into these churches and chapels on his own. Poem, I'm sure a number of people would know, Church Going, where he talks about this musty, tense, unignorable silence that he experiences when he steps into the chapel. And I could very much relate to that. But in fact, being on your own in moments of wonder in the natural world can be equally an epiphany, I think, is my point.
It's lovely because I think both as I was reading it, and really if we think about the people who might be entering this nature writing prize, it's such a beautiful example that it's about the landscape, but also it's about your experience within that. And you can be experiencing a crushed, dried leaf, but that can be the most momentous experience. And it's about your ability to share that with the reader.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. And that, as we were stating earlier, this idea of a kind of an urban population that are writing about nature writing, I think we haven't even seen, anything like that wave of narrative yet. And I think there's so much space for that. I mean, one of the wonders of cities is that they are this gathering place for all our knowledges, our human knowledge. So you go to the British Library and you can have, incredible moments where you're opening these books and, seeing stuff often to do with nature. I mean, that's often a start point for me, is that you're kind of triggered to go on journeys and write things because of the research that you're doing. I mean, one of the key figures, that one of the key initiators of Grounded, of my latest book, was this figure, the Lion Man, which is this incredible carved 30 centimeter high figure from around 40,000 years ago that I first met in the British Museum, in the British Museum, in an exhibition back in 2012 of Ice Age art, which was this incredible, right in the heart of London. And
Yeah.
it was such a fantastically curated exhibition. Jill Cook and others who did so well, in that they created these special kind of perspex panels. So you were encouraged as an observer, as a viewer, to physically lean your head against the panel, so that the figure was right close up to you, and you could see the detail. And the Lion Man is this incredible figure that's half human and half lion, half cave lion. And this is what our ancestors were living with, and this intricately carved figure that's carved in mammoth ivory as well. This idea, like, oh my goodness. And it's a very, I mean, a number of people I spoke to found it an extremely emotive experience to be, because of course the other sensory factor is, as soon as you're leaning that close and your entire view is this figure, everything else just disappears and your entire world is that figure. And I thought it was such a clever technique in allowing the visitors to that exhibition to immerse themselves as much as possible in a world of 40,000 years old, as our ancestors were kind of living, hanging out in caves that were shared with cave lions that are about a third larger than African lions are these days. So, these sizable creatures, and then the mind to think and to imagine some sort of, transmogrification of human and lion. I wouldn't say it blew my mind, but it was an extremely powerful moment. And many years later, it became one of the figures that I kind of thought, how do we as humans mark sacred sites in our worlds? And of course, the point with the Lion Man is that this intricately carved figure was apparently either was placed in the darkest recesses of this cave system, possibly even broken before. I mean, that's slightly up for debate, but this idea that, in some sense was placed as some sort of ritual sacrifice, figurine, for in some way marking the significance of that dark space. And it's a powerful thing to think about. How do we do that in our current world? How do we mark space as being sacred, as being more important than other places, kind of thing?
I love that example of the exhibition, James, because it makes me think about what you're doing with your writing in Grounded, this idea of allowing the reader to get as close to the experience as possible. And one thing that comes to mind is you're interested to know of the ways of people who shared that land with us thousands of years ago. And you're inviting us to lean into this experience, but the experience that comes to you, which is that sense of time travel. You talk about it when we know that land and how it was for our ancestors. It is like time travel. And because of this interesting juxtaposition that you do with you in the landscape, going through your journey, discovering the footprints of our ancestors, we do get that sense of time travel. And it really strikes me that it's not just about how we experience nature or how we experience the past in nature. It's how we can then gather that experience and use words to then hand it over to somebody else. So I'm curious, when you were thinking about how to gather up this experience of time travel, like, is that something that you were really conscious of in terms of, I also want to give the reader this experience of time travel? Or what were you thinking in terms of the experience that you wanted to give the reader?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that idea of time travel has been, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's been slightly taken by the science fiction writers, hasn't it? And we often think of time travelers into some kind of future world. So it's often like kind of spacecrafty and heading off to Mars or something. But I find it fascinating, the idea of, as you say, like journeying into the subtitle is, journeying into the landscapes of our ancestors, which, as you say, is a form of time travel. But I think it's probably not a term that I kind of used, but maybe should have used more often, because that's kind of what you're trying to do. That's what archaeologists do. And if you go, anyone who say goes on a dig and isn't, I mean, I'm not a professional archaeologist in any way. I just kind of look over their shoulders. But absolutely, there's this thrill of excitement amongst everyone if you go to a dig and someone's found something that kind of connects everybody, that site, that place, back in time. Whether you're looking at, an Anglo-Saxon world, or whether you're looking back at, Mesolithic world of hunter-gatherers before we even became farmers, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I think that thrill of learning something of the past as opposed to imagining something of the future is very much sort of often what I'm interested in. And I think it does. It's often very interesting in the sense that it does connect up with with the natural world. And certainly a lot of the time, I think in Grounded, what I was sort of looking to try to get to is the way in which our ancestors in Britain were existing, because it's in Britain such a complex map. It's such a complex land to kind of navigate. And you realize this, that in other parts of the world, I mean, actually, after I'd written the book, but I went to California in May. I was really fortunate to go to California, kind of to meet up with US publishers and kind of explore some of the lands and meet some amazing people. And, as we know, North America was colonized, a few hundred years ago. But what happened before that is clear on the ground, and is still continuing amongst certain cultures that are sort of striving to maintain indigenous and ancestral practices. Try doing that in Britain, and you go. That's a tough gig to try and work out what on earth was going on, because we have so much other things that have taken place. So, and it becomes political as well. I mean, I don't want to sit down and write a book about who were the original Britons, because it becomes political very quickly as well. But what you can delve into there, which is fascinating, is seeing these moments in British history, in world history, where you don't have to go back far, and the natural world is so much more a central part of our everyday existence. And I think those tales then become intriguing to voyage into, and certainly Grounded was to a certain extent kind of plotting and spending ages looking at various of these sacred sites, and then just thinking, right, I'm going to start writing this more fully now. And lockdown, and that period of lockdown, which is when I ended up writing kind of quite a lot of the book, it was a terrible time in so many ways, but what it provided for me was a certain additional freedom to be writing, because I wasn't doing my teaching at university apart from online in sessions like this. And so I suddenly had this time to be writing. And so I sort of thought, well, I can create this kind of sense of pace, of narrative, rather than a journey that is very sort of truncated and just a series of voyages, individual voyages. It was more, right, the journey can really begin now, because I've got this space of time where I didn't, as we all knew, when that lockdown began, we didn't know how long we were going to be stuck in this strange new world. But what I was fortunate is I live out in the kind of the rural worlds of North Essex now, rather than in London. And, anyone who was stuck in the country had a lot more freedom than the people of the cities. And I was able to voyage into the landscape in a kind of 5-mile radius and see aspects of our ancestral history. And it's amazing what you can find if you want to look. And I think that's one of the themes that comes out from the book, that you could probably go anywhere in Britain and dig down, like research, look at, explore the local churches, the local sites of sacred sites. And you find so much. Yeah.
That's interesting to hear you say that because of the experience that you had in lockdown, the book, rather than being this truncated set of experiences, did become more of a fluid journey, because I really got that sense
Yeah.
reading it. And I'm curious, because you had that momentum or that through flow because you were making your own journey. So I'm imagining that helped. But I'm curious now, just before we move on, I'd love to touch on perhaps some of the challenges that you experienced, because here you are, you're trying to convey the spiritual or emotional impact of a place, both in your present experience, but also, how is it for the people who were here thousands of years ago?
Mm-hmm.
So what were the challenges that you had, and you had to then balance your own personal journey with the archaeological exploration?
Mm-hmm.
Give
Yeah,
us a
that's
sense
absolutely
of
right.
that.
I mean, I'm glad you say that, to do with the idea of kind of narrative flow. I think that was very much what I kind of got to. And I thought, well, right, I'm just going to start writing much more. It kind of much more in the immediate, about my immediate environment, than I was intending to. It would have been a different book, in the sense that if we hadn't had lockdown, I'd have been making further journeys, more distant journeys. But genuinely, I mean, maybe I would say this, but I genuinely think it's a better book for not being a kind of, dotted exploration of some of the sacred places, probably of Britain. But I wanted to go into Europe and further. So, again, the carbon footprint would have been bigger. Would it have provided anything? I'd have probably gone to. I mean, the difficulty is you tend to go to the best known sites. And in fact, I'd already been taught that lesson, if I could have just sat down and thought about it, with Walsingham, that going to the most sacred sites doesn't mean that they will be for you as an individual
Yeah.
on that moment and day. That's not to say they're not sacred. But yeah, so I think some of the difficulties, or to kind of answer your question, were almost kind of conceptual, in the sense that I had to kind of go, right, well, like I wanted to say, go back to the Orkney Islands, and and kind of the amazing prehistoric sites up there. I thought, well, I probably would want to go to the Outer Hebrides. Anyone who's ever been to the Outer Hebrides, it's like the finest place to experience nature, if you like, in Britain, just because there's so few humans. But there's also, as I've kind of learned from previous explorations, it's much closer to get to the distant ancestors of sort of the hunter-gatherers. If you go to northwest Scotland, where there's very small British population now, but comparatively there were quite a few people, and you can kind of almost get touch with those people again. So it's like, well, I'm not going to be able to do that, am I? No, I'm not going to be able to do that. But but then you kind of just think, well, I know that I know that there's Bronze Age burial sites just down the road, 2 miles away from me. And it was like, well, I know that 2 villages over, there's potentially what's the only Neolithic stone circle in East Anglia. That needs a little bit of investigation. This kind of practice that, as I say, I think anyone, if you ask them to dig deep into their local landscape, 5-mile radius, and really investigate, it's sometimes harder to do in urban areas. I definitely think that's true. Where I was here, I've lived here for 20 something years already. When lockdown came, I love doing this stuff, so I'd already been digging around and doing the research. I had to do more research. That was not always that straightforward, because I couldn't, for example, go and access the library services at the University of Essex, where I would naturally go to. I couldn't go to the British Library. I couldn't do certain things. But as we know, you can kind of get around some of that with sort of scanning material and people being good, and librarians were great and really helpful. Sent me stuff that was really vital for digging down into these histories. So yeah, it was difficult, but it like in a lot of ways it wasn't, in the sense that I had this time. We had that amazing spring, so I had the natural world, just as I think a number of people in the countryside experienced. Okay, we had a global pandemic. It was a really brutal time in a lot of ways, and not every, people were dying. It was not good. But that spring was amazing, and a number of people would comment on, there's no cars, there's no airplanes. It was suddenly, as humans, we were connected with the landscape in a way that we'd never experienced before, and even in that sense, we were all kind of went out and were kind of on the landscape and kind of desperate for it. And, my family in London, like my sister's family in North London and stuff like, they were going to the parks, and, we had all those images of humans kind of flocking to the natural places to get an experience, get a contact with the natural world, with their landscapes. So it was a very powerful time. And it felt I was sort of tapping into aspects of that by writing this more closely controlled narrative of landscape. And then, of course, we were released briefly in that June or so. And the first thing I did almost was jumped in the car and drove to West Kennet down in Dorset, and spent some time exploring that, because by then I'd got to, in my research, I'd wanted to understand much more about this period in time, this fairly brief period in time where, as humans in Britain, we were becoming farmers. There was some migration to become farmers, and the if you like, the indigenous peoples, the hunter-gatherer peoples that were our ancestors, the last few of them were kind of just kind of disappearing away almost. And these farming communities were coming in, and places like West Kennet were there with the first monuments, with the first stone monuments on this land. So, yeah, it was like it kind of worked okay. I think if I'd gone on much longer beyond June, I'd have been like, but we all were. We were just so desperate to leave our 5-mile plots. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, James. It's so interesting to hear that there were so many external aspects shaping the book, but actually, and I think the book is gorgeous. So I'm really glad to hear that you've got a sense that the book is better for it as well.
Well, that's kind.
I'd love to transition now just to talk a little bit about the MA programme, because actually I've got to confess, since I've heard about it from investigating you, I've been really fascinated about the programme. So I know that the Wild Writing MA programme has a module on psychogeography, which is an area that I'm just wanting to absorb as much as possible. So firstly, I'd love for you to define it for anyone watching this who's like, psychogeography, what's that? As I was when I first heard the phrase. So how would you define it? And what drew you to wanting to explore this on the programme?
Yeah, that sounds a very straightforward question. I have to say that it's not that straightforward to answer, in the sense that I'm actually we're in the middle of the psychogeography, that what we call memory maps, practices in psychogeography module at the moment. And I said to the class day one, I said, obviously one of the things we're going to have to try to do by the end of the course is get a sense of what psychogeography is about. But it's one of those things that's just slippery. It's hard to kind of nail down as a concept even. So you can kind of answer it on certain levels. You can say, well, psychogeography emerges in the 1940s and 50s amongst a group of kind of like intellectual writers in Paris and London, sort of post-war avant-garde way of depicting aspects of the urban world. So, kind of this idea of the dérive. You go on a flaneur, goes on a wander, goes on a dérive, and they kind of write about their experiences. So very kind of sensory journey, often preordained. So they might say, map a certain route that they're going to do before they do it, and then obviously as you head off on a journey, things happen, they get in the way, and you have to then write about that experience. So on one level, that's what psychogeography is, that's where it comes from. But I think on another level, the way in which it's kind of evolved since that time, and both as a practice, as a kind of way of writing, And as a way of kind of seeing landscape and seeing largely urban landscapes, I think is where it's been traditionally seen as a way of writing. So, for example, like what psychogeography I think has been intriguingly good at is kind of going back through canons of literature and saying, well, they're a kind of really interesting kind of proto psychogeographer. So people like Daniel Defoe is often mentioned. Someone like Virginia Woolf will get mentioned as these kind of figures that kind of before psychogeography had even been thought about were practicing a similar thing. They were walking the cities and they were writing about this experience. So Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, for example, which actually became a big seller again during the lockdown period, it's a fascinating vision of London, during the plague years that Defoe wrote. And Virginia Woolf, for example, we were just looking at last week in the module, wrote a very interesting story, a sort of short piece of writing, nonfiction, about walking to buy a pencil in London in 1927. And again, she kind of, one of the great things with good psychogeography is it starts off on this journey, and then you have these musings, these kind of these memories, these kind of other journeys that kind of step in from the past and potentially even from the future, that you might be wanting to do, kind of thing. They come in and they sort of people the narrative to a certain extent. But in terms of the MA Wild Writing, it was a module that was actually first set up by the brilliant mind of Marina Warner, kind of such an important writer in modern British literature. And she was at Essex for a number of years, and I was very fortunate enough to work with her, to attend her classes myself. And she kind of was very keen in this idea of kind of the literature of psychogeography, this way of seeing landscape. And I think that was sort of, even since then, there's been this kind of way in which psychogeography is, I think, been written very well about what some people now call edgelands, or where the city kind of filters out into the countryside. And in fact, I was very keen a number of years ago to be writing the kind of the way in which psychogeography can operate in a non-urban environment. So the kind of the idea of the rural derive, if you like, this kind of the rural wander. And we see it in practitioners like Patrick Keeler, the amazing figure of Patrick Keeler, whose film, is 3 films: London, Robinson in Space, and then Robinson in Ruins, which is in fact where Robinson, this character, then kind of steps out from the urban area and goes into the countryside, and you start getting this idea of the kind of the rural derive. So it's an interesting way of seeing and narrating the journey of an individual writer around a landscape. I think that's the easiest way of seeing psychogeography. But yeah, it's now a core part of our MA offering in wild writing, subtitle literature, landscape, and the environment. So we're trying to both cover, the other compulsory module at the moment is a new nature writing module. So that's a hugely, as we've said, a hugely important emergent kind of shift in the way that nature writing's been in Britain. And psychogeography, I think, is another way in which you've seen this kind of really important narrative evolution of writing on landscape.
I think it's, for me, that when I think about making a journey, whether it's an urban setting, whether it's an entire natural world setting, I can be making that journey and having an experience, but there's something about then adding the act of writing about it that makes it super interesting, because I think sometimes I'm in the journey and I'm thinking, how am I going to write about this? But it isn't until the moment after that I'm actually sitting down and writing about it that 2 or 3 more layers come to me.
Sure.
And perhaps I make connections. So I'm really curious what you think about how the actual act of writing can really add to, enable us to understand the experiences that we're having in the natural world?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways in which is to look at how other people have written. That's often an initiating point where so for example, we go out on field trips. So a couple of weeks ago, we were out, took a group of about 15 of us in the end, that we went out to Tollesbury Wick, a kind of fascinating area of kind of Essex marshland. And we'd read parts of Noreen Massoud's A Flat Place, which is a recent really good book about kind of flat lands, Essex marshlands included kind of thing, and also The Snow Goose. So right back to the kind of post-war vision of this kind of figure out on the Essex marshes. And you could include things like Sabine Baring-Gould's Mahala, back from Victorian melodrama, of the same landscape, these Essex marshlands. And what so that's the written literature, if you like. And then we go out there and we, as you say, we then experience this as a kind of group of sort of writers. And we know how it's been depicted in the past, or how these types of landscapes have been. But then we're there ourselves in the wind and the rain, seeing these things, smelling, seeing, experiencing, talking about, and walking and getting covered in mud and cold and falling over and this kind of thing. And as you say, that you cannot beat the experience for a writer of physically being there and physically experiencing it. But then, and this is where we kind of practice, if you like, the practice of writing by going out on field trips and trying to encourage people to be taking photographs, recording what they're doing, thinking about what they're experiencing. Because when you come to write up, you never quite know what potentially, as I think I do in Grounded, I think I'm going to be writing about this, but in fact, then this happens. And in fact, that then becomes the major point that I want to be making in a write-up. So you kind of need to be both planning on a journey and a narrative, if you like, but open enough to be flexible. That if things change, that's going to be now the focus, I mean, we were out there and bumped into a small group of birders who kind of strangely I kind of had met many years before, and they were, and suddenly they were saying, "Oh, we just saw a peregrine falcon fly over." Suddenly if we didn't actually see one, but if we'd actually seen one, then that becomes potentially, the apex of the journey, the narrative journey, in the sense like suddenly this incredible bird flies past. So it is a balance, isn't it? It is a balance, the story writing afterwards. And we have fantastic exemplars. I mean, Kathleen Jamie's essays, I think, are excellent at doing that, and often starting from the domestic, recognizing the presence in our lives of other factors that are going to affect the journey, the narrative, not keeping them out, not excluding them, but putting them in there and saying, between the washing and the getting the kids to school, I'm going to go and watch peregrine falcons, that kind of aspect.
I love that you touched on this idea of what goes in and what gets left out. Sure. Because I think, again, you mentioned this idea of balance. There's such a balancing act between giving the reader a sense of just being open to see what happens versus kind of boring the reader because you're just looking without aim or without focus. So I'd love to just end with perhaps a little bit of guidance, because I can go on a journey, or I can have had a very healing experience as a result of nature, and I can very much want to talk about it and what happened to me and how I benefited. But how do we balance that between enabling the reader to learn something too, and the reader to have space in their own experience that an unusual experience could happen to them too in the reading of it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's a question that often writers kind of balance and make a call on individually. I mean, the idea of personal disclosure in narrative is quite a big thing at the moment. I think people are almost feeling more freed to express themselves emotionally in their nature writing. So that can be a very good thing. But as you say, sometimes is it we just read someone else's experiences, and in fact we then don't want to express our own or write our own. I think one of the things is sometimes people can over express personal disclosure, over disclose, if you like. And I think, you see that sometimes, and sometimes it's absolutely valid if someone's going on a journey that involves them in some very, very kind of trying personal circumstances. Then really the book is about that. It's about an individual human and their personal journey, and the kind of the nature or the walk or whatever it is just a little bit kind of additional almost, if you like. And I think you can often see these kind of texts. I think for me, it's almost more important that the nature, that the natural world, that our connection with it is the kind of central element to the narrative. I mean, in a book that I wrote fairly recently, The Oak Papers, there was a kind of a personal layering to the narrative, but I never wanted to go too much into that. But I did want to go into the fact that throughout history, oak trees and humans have had this close connection, and that by being connected with ancient oak trees, we feel better. But then the way that I want to do things is say, this is the scientific evidence for it. And then I'm just going to narrate me standing by an oak tree and feeling better, kind of thing, if you know what I mean. So, it is a difficult balance. I guess the important point is that people feel enabled and kind of to have their own embodied narrative experiences of stepping into whatever aspects of the natural world they want to write about. And that kind of, you can't beat the personal journey, but it needs to be done by each individual, doesn't it? I mean, that's where we reconnect with the landscapes, with the natural world, with all these things that need to take place if in any way we're going to be dealing with the climate emergency. If we see ourselves as separate, it's not going to work. So everyone needs to not necessarily just get out there, but even in your kitchen or wherever, notice the ladybirds that are starting to wake up. Notice the changes, the patterns, the movements of the spiders, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's the healthy way forward, I'm sure.
Yeah, lovely. And I also, in terms of this idea of, you were describing with the oak papers, you've got the research, and then we've got your own experience of having that experience of feeling better because of the proximity to the oak trees. I think also what's so lovely about nature writing is, firstly, in the way that we describe nature, we do tend to take things a bit slower, even if it's an urban landscape, because just the nature that we're going through the senses. So the reading experience for me is very calming. And then as a result, it just makes me want to be more aware of what I'm seeing. And that makes me more connected to my surroundings because I'm looking more, I'm listening more.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the narrative needs to reflect the experience, doesn't it? And the truth is that when we are, say out in the woods or something, we, our breathing slows. We go into different meditative brain states. We are calmer beings. We are that's the truth of it. And then, as you said, and therefore we notice things, we look around, and that we're kind of stepping into being our ancestors, in the sense that that's more and more what we're starting to remind ourselves, that for 99 point whatever percent of our time on this earth as a species, we were hunter-gatherer peoples. And that's not to say, the term doesn't even describe it. We were hunter-gatherers and collectors and foragers, and we hung out in woods and hung out with the rest of the natural world. That's what we do. And when we do that now, we feel better. And that's not really that surprising. But the trouble is that we have created some sort of disconnect in some ways so often, just in the last few hundred years in the Western world, if you like, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's a really good, on so many layers, it's so good to step out and step in properly into the natural world, if you like. And as you say, if you do that you do then all those writerly practices of observing and kind of exploring and writing of the experience, they become pretty core. Yeah.
James, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I want to just take a moment to pause, because it may be that in all the things that you've been talking about, something's come to mind that I didn't ask you about. So just take a moment to reflect. Is there anything else that you want to say or add, having had this conversation with me?
No, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's that ability to kind of take a little chunk of time and as you say, kind of explore some of the ways in which we write and the importance of story, the importance of narrating our world, our landscapes, that aren't just ours, but are inhabited by this incredible collection of other living beings, whether they be insects, bugs, cats, trees, whatever, that we kind of share this world with. I think it can only be a healthy thing that we see a continued explosion, if you like, increase in nature writing in Britain. It can only be good for us as a species and for the rest of the world.